Hello, I'm Claire Smith and welcome to my channel. So today's video is going to be a kind of Perfume 101. It's basically going to be a glossary of perfume terms that we hear a lot on YouTube, but actually I think they're quite loosely defined and sometimes I don't think it's necessarily that clear exactly what we mean by them. So I thought I'd just make my own definitions and see what other people think about those definitions. I think if you're someone who's really into fragrance, who watches perfume YouTube a lot, this video might not necessarily be anything new for you, but if you're someone who's just getting into fragrance and is perhaps a bit unsure about these terms, this might be actually quite useful. So if you haven't seen me before, I'm Claire Smith. I make videos all about perfume, perfume science, perfume history, perfume psychology, and I also just do some straight perfume reviews and also fun perfume tags. So if that kind of thing interests you and you haven't already done so, then please do consider subscribing, and please also like this video if you like this kind of content. So if you are someone who's really into fragrance and is perhaps really familiar with some of these terms, I'd be really grateful if you just let me know whether you agree or disagree with what I'm saying in this video, because I think that would be useful for everybody. So please feel free to do that. So I'm going to start off this video by talking about some descriptors that people might use when they're talking about fragrance brands. So people like to drop fragrance brands into categories. They like to call them either designer brands, niche brands, indie brands, celebrity brands, or influencer brands. Sometimes I don't find this kind of classification that useful because sometimes for me it's not very clear cut where a brand falls. It's not necessarily something that's black and white for me, and I'm going to explain why that is later on. But I'm just going to talk you through some quick definitions. So for designer fragrances, I would say a designer brand is a brand that focuses on making other things as well as fragrances. So they might make clothing, they might make bags, they might make jewellery, or they might make some completely weirdly unrelated item like cars, for example. And that would mean that they are classed as a designer brand. So their focus is not solely on fragrance, they do other things. That means they're a designer brand. So within designer perfumes, you have the more affordable brands like Isumaki, Jimmy Choo. Then you have the more middle ground kind of brands like Estee Lauder, Carolina Herrera, those kinds of brands. And then really you have the more expensive brands, so things like Chanel, Dior, Hermes, Tom Ford. Within designer brands, it's also clear that some brands, for example Dior do, and also Chanel do, and even Jimmy Choo do, have higher price point lines, and they call those their private lines. So these lines are really suggesting to the customer that they are more exclusive in some way, or perhaps they're using slightly better ingredients. I think that's really what those brands are trying to get across to their customers, and whether that is actually true or not, that's something that's really very subjective, isn't it? We're never going to know how much they're spending on ingredients for fragrances, and really it's just down to your own taste whether you appreciate those lines or whether you don't appreciate those lines. But I think that's really where designer is trying to get more into the niche side of things, and that's what I'm going to talk about next, niche. So in contrast to designer brands, a niche brand is a brand that sells mainly fragrance. And I say mainly fragrance because I think some people allow them to have perfumed products as a sideline. So things like they could sell lotions or they could sell candles maybe, but really their main product is their fragrance brand. That's really how I would describe niche. So I think the confusion with niche for me is the fact that large conglomerate brands actually own a lot of brands you might think of as niche. So for example, Penhaligon's is owned by Puig. Does that mean that they're no longer niche because they're owned by this huge conglomerate that makes designer fragrances? Also, there are brands such as Byredo that's owned by L'Oreal. Does that mean that Byredo are no longer a niche fragrance brand? Also, there are brands that you might think of as doing mostly fragrance, but actually when you look into their history, they didn't start off as a fragrance brand. So brands such as Diptyque, who actually originally made interior design items. Or brands such as Guerlain, who are actually owned by LVMH now, but even when they were independent, were still making makeup and also lotions as part of their offering. So were Guerlain niche? And are they continuing to be niche, or are they no longer niche and are they designer now? It's really not clear cut sometimes where the line is between niche and designer fragrance. And I think that's really complicated by conglomerate brands, because if something's owned by a conglomerate brand, it might be using exactly the same ingredients as one of its sister designer brands. Its perfumes might be formulated by exactly the same perfumers as a designer brand? And really, is it taking any larger risk with where it's going with its fragrances compared to a designer brand? I think if you are a newbie, don't assume that just because somebody calls something niche, because it's in a slightly nicer bottle with a higher price point, that it's necessarily a better or more inventive fragrance. It can be, but I wouldn't say that's always the case. So another category of fragrance brand is the indie brand, and indie stands for independent. And of course, indie brands could actually be categorized as just a small niche brand. That would be, completely correct to call them niche as well. But I think the thing that marks indie brands out from niche brands in general is the fact that they are run by sole traders. So there is usually one person who puts the heart and soul into making these fragrances, who is generally the perfumer behind the fragrances as well. And everything is done in-house, and it's usually quite a small batch kind of style fragrance making. And I think these brands are really the special ones, because I think if you want something at a reasonable price point, but is slightly more inventive, slightly more out there, that really has someone's personality stamped on the fragrance, something that isn't just, something you will have smelt before, I think indie is probably where it's at. So you won't see indie fragrances talked about as much on YouTube, and there are various different reasons for that, but really you can sum that up in three categories. One, independent fragrance brands will not be big givers of PR. So people aren't going to talk about them as much because they actually have to pay for those fragrances. Two, the independent fragrance brands won't have worldwide distribution in general. So that means that people can become alienated from watching videos if they can't then go and try those fragrances themselves. And that's something that influencers don't want to do either, because they don't want to alienate their watchers for a start, but they also don't want to not be able to earn affiliate income from people buying those fragrances. Also, those videos just don't get as many views, and that's because if people haven't heard of something, they are less inclined to click on the video. So that's really why you don't hear about independent fragrance on YouTube. It's not because it's worse, it's not because it's more expensive, it's just because it's not as well known. So for some examples of independent fragrance brands, I would talk about things such as 4160 Tuesdays, Mabel Orama, One Way Bridge, perhaps even Olfactive O. Those kinds of brands are really the brands that I would designate as independent fragrance. So moving back towards the more mainstream categories of fragrance, there are brands that are designated as celebrity brands. So these brands are generally created by larger conglomerate brands, and a celebrity is asked to be the figurehead of that brand. That their name will be all over the bottles, all over the boxes. They will take part in the marketing campaigns. There will generally be a theme around whatever they are doing at the moment. So, for example, Ariana Grande's fragrances are very themed around her music. And those fragrance brands have been incredibly successful in perfume history. So, for example, Elizabeth Taylor has been a very, very successful celebrity fragrance brand, as well as brands like Britney Spears, Jennifer Lopez, also Ariana Grande, and even more recently Billie Eilish have been incredibly successful. So celebrity fragrances are generally a slightly more affordable price point. It really amazes me sometimes who actually does have a celebrity fragrance brand. So I was really shocked to learn that actually Donald Trump has a fragrance brand. I find that absolutely amazing, really, that he's got a fragrance brand. I don't think I'd want to wear Trump's fragrances. So another category of fragrance brand that's really even just grown out of YouTube, which I find interesting, is the influencer fragrance. And really there's a whole brand of influencer fragrances called Navitus. So Navitus was set up by somebody on YouTube who realised the potential for actually using influencers to market fragrances. And each of the fragrances in the range is really attached to an influencer and is promoted heavily on YouTube by that influencer. I guess because they earn money from the sales of that fragrance. But it's also true that people on YouTube have made fragrances independently, and there have also been people who have collaborated with other brands. So for example, Smurfy Girly Claire collaborated with 4160 Tuesdays to make her fragrances. So I think really my point from all of this discussion of these different categories of fragrance brands is really that you just need to go away and try these fragrances. It doesn't really matter what it says on the label or what your impression is of that brand. You just need to go and try the fragrances. If you like them, you like them. If you don't, you don't. So next I'm going to talk about the different names for fragrance formulations, and really these different names denote the different amounts of fragrance oil that are within these formulations. But I still think that these are quite loose categories, and I would say that there are a few categories that you hear about loads, and then there are other categories of fragrance that you don't really hear talked about at all. So the lowest level of fragrance oil that's marketed in a formulation would be something like an Eau Fraîche. That's going to be around 1 to 2% of perfume oil. And I don't really see those talked about at all nowadays. I think they're really quite rare. There's also, at that end of the scale, Eau De Cologne. So Eau De Colognes are things that are probably between about 2 and 5% in perfume oil content. When I think of Eau De Colognes, I think of the older Acqua di Parma scents. And I also think of 4711 Eau De Cologne. Those really are quite light, citrusy kind of fragrances, and they are things that don't tend to last too long. You might also think of brands like Santa Maria Novella, and that's quite an old brand, and they quite often market fragrances in Eau De Cologne formulations. These fragrances aren't meant to be things that last all day, they're meant to be things that are quite refreshing, things that make you just feel cleaner. So next you have the more common levels of formulation of fragrance, so things like Eau De Toilette, which are 5 to 15% of fragrance oil, and then formulations like Eau De Parfum. So you will have seen those really a lot in stores. So Eau De Parfums are anything between about 15 to 20, maybe even 25% perfume oil, although 25% is really pushing it. I think my advice is that if you really like a fragrance and it comes in lots of different formulations, go and try the Eau De Toilette, go and try the Eau De Parfum. Don't just assume that you will just like the stronger formulation, because often different formulations will have slightly different note profiles. They might even be almost like a flanker fragrance. They won't be a carbon copy, just lighter. They will actually have different note profiles. So it's always worth going to try the different versions of a fragrance, because often, in my experience, Eau De Toilettes last just as long as Eau De Parfums. And I know that's not always the case, but it has been the case in some of the fragrances that I've experienced. So for example, one that really stands out to me as something that's incredibly long lasting that I tried both versions of is Versace Crystal Noir. I have the Eau De Toilette. It still lasts on me the whole day and into the next day. So I really don't see any reason why you would choose the Eau De Parfum over the Eau De Toilette there if you actually prefer the smell of the Eau De Toilette. There's really no reason why you would choose it based on the concentration of the perfume oil there. So in contrast to what I just said about the exception with fragrances like Versace Crystal Noir, the generally accepted wisdom on Eau De Toilettes is that they last less time on skin than Eau De Parfums. And the reason for that is because they've got a higher alcohol content, they've got a lower fragrance oil content, which means that they are more volatile and they dissipate from your skin more quickly. But the upside of this is that they may project more, because actually having that higher volatility means that you get this burst of fragrance initially. And that means that Eau De Toilettes particularly shine with the top notes. So if you really love the top notes of a fragrance, you might want to check out the Eau De Toilette formulation over the Eau De Parfum. But definitely try both. So Eau De Parfums, or EDPs, are generally accepted to be the most commonly purchased formulation. Generally, when a fragrance house releases a new line of fragrances, they will release the Eau De Parfum first. That's generally the first fragrance, the pillar fragrance in any line, as opposed to the flanker fragrances that come after it will be the EDP. So I think there's really been a shift over time in people choosing EDPs versus EDTs. I really feel like EDTs were much more popular back in the day. And if you think about it, certain fragrances were actually marketed solely as EDTs. You, for example, did not get an EDP version ever of Gucci Rush, for example. Or you didn't get an EDP version of Rive Gauche, for example. And I don't know whether that's some kind of shift in the ingredients that are actually used in fragrances nowadays versus that were used many years ago, and whether that means that maybe the formulations are slightly quieter than they once were, and that's maybe why people are shifting towards stronger formulations, perhaps. I'm not really sure, or whether it's just heavier marketing of EDPs, a perception of EDPs being stronger and therefore somehow better. Perhaps I really don't know what the reason is behind that shift. but there has been a shift from the popularity of EDTs to the popularity of EDPs. Of course, for some men's fragrances, still EDTs are the standard. EDTs are the pillar fragrance in lines, although that again is changing. I feel like male marketed fragrances are being marketed very much along the same lines as female marketed fragrances. And really in future it might be more likely that you will only really get the EDP being the pillar fragrance and not the EDT. So at the other end of the scale, we've got things like parfums, which are between about 25 and 35%. Although none of these categorisations actually have a hard and fast defined amount of perfume oil that must be legally within these fragrance formulations. That's the important thing to remember. None of this is really legally defined. You also have things like extraits, which are generally 35 to 45% perfume oils. So you can imagine that these are actually really very oily fragrances. I think these fragrances have the perception of things that last longer and that are stronger. I wouldn't necessarily agree with that because I think it depends on the type of fragrance that you're looking at. So if you're looking at a citrus fragrance, for example, that's quite a top-heavy fragrance. Citrus notes dissipate quite quickly. So even if you buy an extrait version of a citrus fragrance, that citrus note is still going to be gone quite quickly. Also, if you really like base heavy fragrances, or anyway, then if you buy the extrait version of that fragrance, it really might not change too much how it smells to you. I think you just need to go and try them and see if it's worth the extra money for you to buy the extrait versus the standard EDP. I quite often feel that fragrance companies tend to market extraits when they've had a success with another fragrance. And I think a great example of this would be something like Amouage's recent success with Guidance. They've now launched an extrait version of that fragrance. Similarly, Baccarat Rouge 540, they launched an extrait version of that fragrance. And I think really those brands would never have launched an extrait version of those fragrances without the huge success the original pillar fragrance had. And I often am a bit dubious. I often just think that extraits are perhaps marketing tools because they make people look again at that fragrance line, and it also just provides the consumer with something else to buy, isn't it? It's the next best thing, the extrait. You've got the original, you love the original, you're going to go out and buy the extrait because the extrait might be even better. I guess the designer brand version of this is when designer brands market fragrances that are called things like Elixir and Intense. That kind of gives the suggestion of something stronger, doesn't it? Something that's been distilled, something that it has a higher level of fragrance oil in it, whether it does or not. And I think that's really clever marketing. So next, let's talk about the difference between ingredients and notes. So the ingredients are the individual items that make up that fragrance. So for example, you're always going to have alcohol in there, you're always going to have water in a fragrance. You're probably also going to have fragrance oils in a fragrance and probably some synthetic ingredients as well. You will also perhaps, just as part of the fragrance, have something that's actually the fixative, the thing that actually melds the fragrance to your skin. And you will also have antioxidants in a fragrance or a UV filter, something to protect that fragrance from being degraded by light, to give it a longer lifespan. So of course, ingredients in fragrances can be natural or they can be synthetic. I don't think there's anything wrong with having synthetic perfume ingredients. The advent of synthetic fragrance ingredients really promoted this explosion in perfumery that we've had since the 1800s. And it's been really important in diversifying the smells that we can capture in fragrances. Synthetic ingredients are much easier to control because you know a synthesis pathway to make that fragrance ingredient. It's a controlled ingredient where there is one molecule making up that smell, and that ingredient can be added in a predictable way to a fragrance to make a particular smell. So with some ingredients, there are only synthetic options. For example, if you look at fruits, citrus fruits are very good at providing oils which can be used in fragrances. So you can very easily use naturals when it comes to citrus fruits. But if you want to really evoke the smell of a peach or the smell of strawberries or the smell of raspberries, you're going to need synthetic compounds. So for example, for strawberries, you might use C16 aldehyde. For raspberries, you might use raspberry ketone. It's just not something that you can get from nature, those kinds of smells. So that's always going to be synthetically made in fragrance. It's the same with some florals, so frangipani, lily, peony, heliotrope, violet. Those are all made synthetically or through mixtures of synthetic compounds with natural extracts to try to evoke the smell of that flower in nature. So next, notes. Notes are something that's very separate to ingredients. They're really a marketing tool. They are what the perfumer or what the perfume brand are trying to convey to the customer. Because actually, if you do have a fragrance with some interesting sounding notes, that can really make somebody want to go into a store and try it. So why do perfume brands not just simply list the ingredients of the fragrance? Well, which sounds better to you? Ethyl maltol or cotton candy? Isobutyl quinolone or leather? Javanol or sandalwood? Benzoyl salicylates or solar notes? It's clear, isn't it? Which one is the consumer going to understand more? Notes, in effect, are how a fragrance is perceived by an individual, and that individual who actually writes down those notes is probably somebody from the brand. But really, everybody is going to perceive that fragrance differently. Some people are going to smell some of the notes, some people might not smell any of the notes, some people might smell something completely different. You know, if you present someone with a fragrance, not having shown them the notes, I think most people would smell something probably quite different to what's listed. And that's just the reality of fragrance. We just all perceive fragrances very differently. We all have different experiences with fragrances. I think if you smell a lot of perfumes, you might get something sometimes approaching the notes, but it's very unlikely you're going to smell every single item that's listed. So listed notes for fragrances are generally organised into a fragrance pyramid. And this is the idea that you smell the top notes first, then you smell the middle notes, the heart notes, and then you smell the base notes. In reality, from my experience of fragrances, it does not work like that. You quite often, as I've said, do not smell every single note in a fragrance. And quite often you will get a fragrance where different notes from different stages appear actually all together. So, for example, if you have a more linear fragrance, you might have something where you smell the top, middle, and the base to some degree from the outset. Equally, you might have a fragrance that really moves through stages, and you might actually get this, traditional arrangement of notes where you smell the top notes, then the mid, and then the base. But that's so rare that you get that very perfect separation of the notes. Normally you'll smell probably a mishmash really, and whilst it will change, and clearly will get more base heavy as it goes through, it's definitely not something that's delimited in time periods. So top notes in general are going to be lighter fragrance molecules. That's why they're the top notes. They're the things that evaporate from the fragrance first. That's why you smell them first. They're the most volatile because they're the lightest molecules. So things like citruses are going to be the things that are going to be the top notes. You might also have lighter florals, perhaps even pink pepper is quite a common top note as well. Often when people are explaining fragrance pyramids, they will give you time frames for which the top notes should appear, the mid notes should appear, and the base notes should appear. In my experience, that is incredibly variable. I would say the top notes for me sometimes last only a matter of seconds even. In some fragrances, other fragrances, they can go on throughout the whole lifetime of the fragrance. So I don't really see the usefulness in that. But, in general, the top notes should appear before the base notes. But as I've said, it's not always the case. So the mid notes or the heart notes are really the part of the fragrance that makes the fragrance the fragrance. They're the really distinctive thing that adds the character to the fragrance, really. I think quite often mid notes are florals. They can be certain darker fruits, for example. And finally, the base notes are really what you're left with at the end of the fragrance. Once it's dried down and the fragrance has stopped evolving, they're the last thing that you tend to smell. So often base notes will be actually the things that meld the fragrance to your skin as well. So great fixatives are things like sandalwood, vanilla, woods, musks, for example, and they're often base notes. And those are the heaviest molecules in the fragrance. And that's why they linger longer, because they take longer to evaporate. So you might also hear people talk about accords. I'm not so good about talking about accords. I just call everything a note, and that's technically not correct. So accords are really combinations of notes that give a particular feeling to a fragrance. So for example, amber is an accord and not a note because it's made up of different things. So for example, amber is going to be vanilla and resins usually. It can sometimes be styrax, benzoin, it can be labdanum, it can be patchouli, that give off this kind of warmth to it, a warm powderiness normally, amber, although there are different types of amber, clearly, because there are different things that can go to make the amber accord up. So next, let's talk about the performance indicators of a fragrance. So people would describe fragrances here on YouTube and also in other types of review format with descriptions of how long they last. So they talk about the longevity of the fragrance. So for me, I think the longevity I want from fragrances is going to vary from situation to situation. I don't need a fragrance to last a long time if I'm just using it while I'm dropping off to sleep. Alternatively, if I'm going to work, I want a fragrance that's going to last 8-9 hours because I want to be able to smell it by the end of the day as well. Or I want to have something last till lunchtime at least, so I can then refresh my fragrance at lunchtime and enjoy it throughout the day. Demands on longevity is something that's very personal to each person and personal to the situation in which the fragrance is going to be worn. Some people just want completely long-lasting fragrances at all times. They think that it's poor value to buy something that doesn't last for very long. And I understand that opinion for sure, but I think that there are just some notes in perfumery that just don't tend to last very long. It's just not something you're going to find in the world of fragrance, a long-lasting, heavily citrus-based fragrance without some kind of supporting note structure to help it along. I think too, longevity is something that varies on different people's skins. So I've made an entire video about why fragrances can smell different on you as opposed to somebody else. And really I explain that kind of concept as part of that video. So if you're interested in that point, you can go and watch that video if you want to know more. But really people have different ways of applying fragrance and they also have different skin, which means that it can last shorter amounts of time or longer amounts of time. And also people have different perceptions of perfume. People perceive fragrance very differently and that can influence how long they think that fragrance is lasting on them. But it's all in that video. So next, let's look at projection. So projection is really how far away from somebody you have to be standing to be able to still smell their fragrance. I think the projection that you want from a fragrance is going to really depend upon the situation that you want that fragrance for again. And I think it's really going to be a very personal kind of decision as to what kind of level of projection you're going to want from fragrances. So if I'm going to bed, I truly don't mind a skin scent. It's just for me to smell while I'm going to sleep. So skin scents are perfect. If I'm going to work, I want something quiet, but I don't want something that's entirely a skin scent. If I'm going out, I want something louder. I want something that other people probably can smell. I think projection is really, really hard to judge actually, because a lot of fragrances are very loud for the first sort of 20 minutes while the top notes are still around. And then after that, it really begins to drop. And I think you can only really truly judge the projection of a fragrance after about 20-30 minutes. That's the point at which most fragrances are calming down massively. So people on YouTube will use the terms beast mode or room filler to describe fragrances with massive projection. And they will also use the term skin scents to describe fragrances that are very close to skin or that you can't smell unless you actually get your nose right up to them. So next is sillage, and people quite often mistake the term sillage for projection. They're two very separate things. So sillage actually means trail. So it's all about the trail that your fragrance leaves. So say, for example, you get in a lift and you can still smell a person's fragrance who's been in the lift before you, even though you didn't see the person. That is sillage. That is the trail that that fragrance has left from where that person has been. So I think sillage for some people can be a little bit embarrassing. It can be something that people don't want. That people don't want to have a huge trail left behind them. Other people absolutely love that. Other people just want to be known by their fragrance. And if you can still smell the fragrance after the person has long left, some people think that's amazing and really want that in their lives. So again, your preferences for sillage are going to be very personal and very dependent on the situation. So for example, at work, you're probably not going to want a fragrance with immense sillage. You don't want to smell all the way down the corridor, for instance. Whereas if you were in a club or if you were out and about, you might want something with a bit more oomph, with a bit more of a trail about it so that people could smell where you've been. I think from a fragrance reviewer's point of view, judging your own sillage is going to be quite a difficult thing to judge. The way I actually judge it is if I think a fragrance is leaving a trail, I will take it to work, get somebody at work to wear it, and then I will see whether I can smell where they've been at work. Because I can't judge it on myself. It's just not something you can assess, is it? So that's really the only way I can actually review that aspect of fragrances. And yeah, sorry to the people at work, but yeah, they are my guinea pigs. But yeah, those are the three main things that people talk about: longevity, projection, and sillage. So that's the final aspect of fragrance that I'm going to be talking about in this video. I can do another one of these if you do enjoy this video. If you do enjoy this video, then please press the like button and please also consider subscribing if you haven't done already. And thank you so much for watching, and I'll see you in the next one. Bye.